The digital revolution exploded with video games.
Gaming has developed as one of the most advanced forms of digital media.
I think there's a hunger to participate in media.
And it was up to the video game creators to feed the hungry.
Part of my ambition is to make the player as much of the designer as I am.
The players became gods.
They're omniscient, that they're all-powerful, that they get to make all the important decisions.
They can actually express themselves with the tools created, by these game makers.
For good.
We're giving you these powers.
And for evil.
But it's up to you what you do with them.
1958. William Higginbotham entertained visitors with his oscilloscope at Brookhaven Laboratory in New York. Tennis for Two was the first computer game, and it started an industry that by the 80s was entertaining millions.
I think a lot of those games, the early video games, the most important cultural influences were from the time. When you remember what 1980 was like, 80 to 85, everybody was worried about intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the arms race.
That decade, President Ronald Reagan proposed to increase defense in the US by launching the Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed by the press as the Star Wars program.
The question is not, will strategic defenses be developed? The question is rather, will the Soviet Union be the only country to possess them? The choice is ours.
If you think about Reagan's Star Wars program, this kind of idea that there'd be a computer-controlled defense shield around the US that could zap missiles as they came in. I mean, this really is kind of like a giant-scale avocation of Missile Command, which is one of the most popular games in the early 80s.
And that's quite literally about ICBMs coming down and you blocking the intercontinental ballistic missiles. But even that, I think, is actually a reflection. It's early 80s. It's when everybody's worried about the bomb.
Zapping an enemy at the push of a button was now as exciting in real life as it was in video games.
You could also see that the Star Wars program was part of a bigger idea that historians now look back on the Reagan era as contributing to the end of the Cold War by putting so much money into technology that they pushed the defense race so far that the Soviet Union couldn't afford it anymore and collapsed.
The end of the Cold War and the disappearance of an age-old enemy also marked the beginning of a new era in video games, where designers could explore scenarios other than war and conflict. The original generation of gamers now had a different perspective of the world, and thus emerging game designers like Peter Molyneux brought a new perspective to the video game, where the player was the hand of God.
Well, I'll be honest with you. The actual reason it was a god is down to my incompetence as a programmer. Because there's one thing that every games program knows how to do, is called navigation. And it's getting a character in the game to move from point A to point B. I was such an atrocious programmer, I couldn't work out a way of doing that. So I thought, oh God, what I'm going to do is they're complicated, I can't get them around these routes, they've got to find their way around corners and over. It doesn't matter, I'll just get the player to raise the land up so the little people can get to the place, and that was the birth of it.
Other game designers, such as Sid Meier and Will Wright, also gave players a top-down perspective and total control in their games.
The term God game refers to kind of a perspective that the player has in playing at the game, that they're omniscient, that they're all-powerful, that they get to make all the important decisions. A lot of people don't have that ability in real life, and to give that to them in a game is really entertaining and fun. So games like Civilization, SimCity are God games in that you get to make all the important decisions.
To me, God games are interesting because this is the ultimate managerial game, right? So while we're all put in these positions in our jobs where we have to manage projects, manage people, and so forth, then, like, to kill time, we go and manage something even more complicated, like how to build a city, how to create a new civilization, and so forth.
God games allowed people to live out their wildest managerial fantasies. And even greater than that, they gave them the ability to be God, giving players the feeling of having ultimate power by giving them choices they never had in games before. But the real gods were the designers who created these worlds. And the first step was to build a city. The 1980s was an era of change, marked by a civil war in El Salvador, a student massacre in China, and a world recession.
Just going down and down and down, never stopped.
The decade also saw the fall of the Iron Curtain.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
The communists lost to the capitalists, and the war that had kept the world in virtual fear for more than 40 years was finally over. In a world full of uncertainty, players found assurance in a video game that gave them control.
I think that people are attracted to the fantasy of controlling systems, controlling lives, controlling the uncontrollable in games because it can be done, right? And in our real lives, there are so many factors, and we can't understand the factors, much less control them.
Just as the fear of an evil empire was subsiding in the real world, video games were expanding the traditional narrative of good versus evil into games with more open-ended narratives, like in Will Wright's SimCity.
I still remember it when that came out. I couldn't imagine a more boring premise for a game. You get to simulate, which already that sounds boring, the exciting process of zoning and developing an urban environment. What could be less interesting than that? It sounds like something you'd create for a college graduate course or something. But of course, Will's a genius.
What's so interesting about SimCity is its origins. In 1984, Will Wright made his first video game, which was actually called Raid on Bungling Bay, which to this day he refers to as a stupid shoot-'em-up game.
SimCity kind of evolved from Bungling Bay in that I was designing the islands that you were bombing, and I had to write a program that would let me kind of move around and basically create this world. So I was the one creating the world. The player would just fly around and bomb it. But I had more fun creating it than I did flying around and bombing it. And so I took that part, that tool that I built for myself, and then kept developing it. And that eventually evolved into SimCity.
Meanwhile, new political rules were developing in the world, but their outcomes would not be seen for a long time. Therefore, video games like SimCity helped players understand the complex world better by seeing cause and effect immediately modeled in a computer game.
That's a big part of what is difficult about the largeness of our world and the interconnectedness of our world is that we just don't see the cause and effect any longer. We vote, we don't really feel that we had any say. We, go and make an effort towards, say, living our lives in a green way, but do we really see the long-term effects? It's very difficult to feel the sense of cause and effect. And these games play into that need to both be a part of a large system, but also somewhat in control of that very large global system.
Unlike real life, where progress was excruciatingly slow and fraught with frustration, God games could show dramatic, if not real, results instantly.
These games are essentially about chaos theory or about emergence, the idea that one very small action can have very large consequences. The choices that you make through the game determines what the game looks like, where the game takes you, what the end scenario is.
The success of SimCity in the late 1980s and early 1990s confirmed that players wanted games that were more intelligent.
SimCity often gets thought of as the smart person's game because it became wildly, wildly popular among college students in the early 90s. These are people who probably hadn't played games since they'd had Taris or maybe the Odyssey or played Space Invaders or Pac-Man at an arcade. And then SimCity came out, and they were probably in college, and they had a computer, and they could play it. And so a lot of people who otherwise would not self-identify as gamers were brought back into the fold of gaming through SimCity, which in the video game industry is something really, really important to have games that do that.
SimCity was like a virtual garden where Wright planted the seeds, but it was up to the player to tend to it. Players used the simple rules set by Wright and watched their cities grow.
Part of the genius of Will Wright was that he understood to build simulations and that people were going to get into them. You know, you start putting food in a petri dish and you watch the bacteria expand. That's an emergent system. There are rules, and you start poking and letting those rules play out, and complex things start happening.
In some sense, I really like games where I, as the player, can figure out what the goal state is. And there are multiple goal states. I can make my city the largest possible city or the lowest crime, and then go for that goal. So the player, in some sense, is being forced to make a value judgment at the beginning.
Players had control over whether their city would succeed or fail. They had the freedom of choice to make decisions in a game that people didn't have in the real world. Once the excitement about the end of the Cold War subsided, people awoke to an endless list of problems and complications they had not anticipated.
The opening of the wall, there was this amazing euphoria and happiness, and people were ready to do whatever. They were ready to kind of share and give and take into account that maybe there's a whole lot of problems to be overcome. The installation of the political system, this changed, and we have a kind of an ongoing curve of dissatisfaction. So out of that moment of euphoria, you have all the political problems, economical problems in particular.
There was no longer a clearly defined axis of good or evil, and people were left to decide for themselves what was right and what was wrong in the world. It was a perfect time for Peter Molyneux to release his game Populous, where players could explore their own ethics through the eyes of a deity.
When Populous first came out, it was kind of the right time. There was a lot of talk about morality, and the Middle East situation was going on. Actually, Salman Rushdie, this famous author, had written the Satanic Verses, and he'd had a fatwa against him, and there was lots of, in the media, there was all about good and evil.
The fatwa the Iranian leader Ruhollah Khomeini issued against Rushdie spread terror throughout the world and raised debate about freedom of speech and religion. Molyneux's video game Populous struck a chord with people overwhelmed by newfound freedoms.
I've always had this real obsession, and it is an obsession, of trying to, some way, create life inside a game. How can I make these little people seem like, they're alive?
In Molyneux's later game, Black and White, he programmed the true complexity of human nature. He gave the player the ability and the choice to be a good or evil god.
Look at them. Just look at them. These are miraculous creatures indeed.
They certainly are, but not quite as big as I expected.
Unlike the games that had come before this, you had a view of a kind of microcosm of the world, because you literally have a control that puts you in the role of like a demigod, and you can influence a people.
Okay, we're giving you these powers, but it's up to you what you do with them. Now that is you deciding what moral message, what moral course that you want to take in the game. Now, is that wrong for me to give you the power to do something? Or is the wrong the fact that you did it?
Although the player felt like he was God in the God games, the real gods were the designers who became moral arbiters of a sort, deciding the rules of these worlds.
I say you're kind of a demigod because you only have the godlike controls that the developer gives you. So like Peter Molyneux's big game's called Black and White. And there you have little villagers that you control, and you have a godlike hand that goes over the woods and the trees, and you can grab trees for them and give it to them as wood. But if you do that, the villagers start saying, "We need more wood, give us more wood." They're praying to you. And so you have to go and grab more wood.
thank you for this wood.
And the more you give them, the more they start begging you.
There's no food on the table, and we can't sell unless we're able. So we ain't going nowhere till we get some grain.
And that's part of Peter Molyneux's design. It's a kind of a statement on religion. Is once you start entrusting your abilities to a higher power, then you start losing initiative.
Help! Someone help us! Child. We call to the heavens!
Every time they asked for a bit of food, you were there as their God giving them food. Every time they asked for mercy, you were there giving them mercy. Or, and personally this interests me slightly more, you could decide to be the most vicious, mean, evil God. If they were asked for food, you don't care. If they asked for mercy, that was an excuse to pick one of them up and throw them off the nearest cliff. And that sort of finding out what sort of person you really are was central to what Black and White was.
Molyneux also implemented into Black and White artificial intelligence, a computer application first used in the military to predict the path of a plane or missile, given its radar data during World War II.
The big rush to build computers during World War II is for ballistics computations. You know, the whole notion that I'm going to fire a projectile up here and the Earth is tilted this way, and how do we make sure it lands in the right place? And those all used to be done by hand. And they said, well, you know, there's a lot of mistakes. We can turn this into automation.
A scientist named Alan Turing was heavily involved in the military during World War II and helped create a machine to break the German Enigma code. He also first wrote about artificial intelligence, or AI, in 1950. The paper described the Turing test, which tested a machine's artificial intelligence capability by asking a person to distinguish between a dialogue with a computer and a dialogue with a human.
The genius of the Turing test that Alan Turing came up with was he was trying to define what is intelligence, and he decided, well, okay, I think the best definition of intelligence is that if I can convince a person on the other side of the screen that they're interacting with an intelligent system, then it is.
The first video games were very simple in that there wasn't any AI. There was really kind of just an input and a reaction. As games evolved, developers added more things such as pattern-based AI, and really, it wasn't intelligence, it was simply that if you did that, the enemy does this pattern. And soon enough, players in Pac-Man would figure out exactly how the ghosts move through the maze and what to do in order to always survive. And once you figured that out, the games kind of lost their appeal as kind of being unpredictable and challenging. But as games evolved, clever developers came up with new ways of artificial intelligence.
AI really happens in the head of the player. If the player is convinced that, you know, this thing is intelligent or behaving in an intelligent manner, then it is. It doesn't really matter what's happening under the hood. And under the hood generally is simpler things than you might imagine. And so, in some sense, you might even call it trickery.
So we cheat. The games industry cheats with its AI, its artificial intelligence. But there's no question about it. Without artificial intelligence, even shooters would be poor. Far poorer than they are today. What wraps up everything about artificial intelligence is the ability for the game to react to what you're doing rather than react to what I designed.
In a game like Black and White, players felt powerful because Molyneux gave them the tools to not only manipulate a character's movements, but also his personality.
Now slap him by moving your hand quickly from side to side across him.
He architected the artificial intelligence of the people that you care for sort of with moral philosophy in mind, and they would behave based on different ethical principles.
Greetings, we're your conscience. Good and evil, yin and yang, black and white.
There needed to be something more than just a lot of little people to care for. I wanted there to be something that was truly yours to care for, and there was this mystical creature, and this creature really featured a huge amount of AI in it, so it could learn what sort of creature you wanted it to be.
Look in my eyes, what do you see? The cult of personality.
So if you wanted to make the most vicious, evil, nasty, person-eating creature that would go out and smash everything up, you could make that sort of creature. Or you can make the most kindest, gentlest creature of all.
Stroking tells him you approve of him, and it makes him happy.
And so the game really was about, given ultimate power, what would you do with it?
In the early 1990s, a new world order was ushered in, but not without problems. Conflicts like the Balkan Wars, the Rwandan genocide, and the First Gulf War were the early signs of a clash of civilizations in the post-Cold War world. With the world changing so drastically, it was compelling for a player to take a turn at solving world problems in a game like Sid Meier's Civilization, where the player became the ruler of his or her own empire.
The kind of inspiration for Civilization was start very small, but by the end of the game, kind of conquer the world, create a world that you've had a part in shaping and forming.
Civilization essentially is about building an empire that will stand the test of time at its most simple. Who doesn't want to take something and build it into the greatest empire of all times, from prehistoric age all the way up to the modern day, and do everything you need to do, that is negotiating, that is buying and selling, that is dealing with ruthless leaders, that is dealing with other civilizations? Who doesn't want to immerse themselves in that kind of experience where you're always one step ahead of the competition?
The creators of Civilization, Black and White, and SimCity built digital sandboxes for players to design their own stories.
I think the most interesting aspect about games is the fact that they're inherently malleable. You know, every player is going to have a different experience, which is fundamentally different than movies, television, books. And I think that is going to be the really interesting area in which games expand, to where, you know, not only are you choosing your own path in a game that's different than my path, but the game itself is observing and learning about you. And then the game can actually start customizing itself uniquely to you, evolve to fit you, and evolve to entertain you, and be as personal to you as your dreams might be.
Having the sense of ultimate power in a game was fun. But for some, having the power to transform the game itself would soon become even more thrilling.
Son of a...
The end of the Cold War brought with it great freedoms and opportunities. But regions of the world that were once stabilized by the American and Soviet stalemate suddenly exploded into conflict. The paradigm of good versus evil disappeared, and it was into this world that a new generation of video game players reached maturity.
Culturally at that time, I think, this was the generation that, was sort of anti-establishment. It was a group of people sort of trying to find their voice and struggling to find their voice and struggling to find the causes that they cared about.
They were known as Generation X because they were an unknown quantity who rejected everything generations before them had embraced and accepted. Angst-filled lyrics mixed with a twist of punk rock was known as grunge music, and it became the anthem for a generation looking for its own identity. Although they may have rejected status, Generation X, also known as the third generation of gamers, did not reject technology.
First generation was people that literally just sort of appreciated games as a pastime. The second generation were people that really felt like games were, part of the culture, part of the entertainment culture. And now you're seeing this exciting new third generation that are appreciating games as an artistic form, but also as a platform for expression, and feeling like this is something this is how they're going to express themselves to the world.
Before the peer-to-peer internet revolution and sites like eBay, Napster, and MySpace, video games became a medium that democratized creativity by putting the power in the hands of the players.
What was interesting, I think, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, is you had individuals able to actually create commercial products by themselves. Over time, the games got more sophisticated and it took a larger group of people, and it became a little bit like movies, where it was this elite priesthood. You had to belong to a game company, and then you could get to work on and develop games. But a funny thing happened in the 90s, which is that people created tools as part of the game so that people who bought those games could create their own games. They didn't have to be an employee of a game company. They didn't have to have a degree or some other mark of belonging. They just had to have the creativity and the desire, and now there were tools available to them.
I think that the current generation growing up is growing up in a very different media environment. You know, for them, media is this very malleable thing that they expect to be able to control. They expect to be able to, basically make their own CDs, their own videos, and even customize, things in their games. So I think that the games as a medium are probably going to be one of the most extensive examples of players being able to customize the experience and, in some sense, design their own games. Somebody can start, as a consumer of a game and slowly customize more and more of it up to the point where they might be doing really hardcore mods of the game. In some sense, basically creating their own game. So there's actually a very smooth ramp now from being a consumer of media to being a producer. Whereas before there used to be this big wall, and the producers on one side would throw, media over to the consumers on the other side.
In a lot of ways, I think that was realizing the potential of what the PC revolution was all about, which was giving that power, giving that great tool back to the people, to the individual, because those are the people who are going to take us in some of the more interesting and innovative and creative directions.
Everything that has enabled the internet to grow and these companies to grow has come by that extensibility and by personalization and all that. But early on, the reason these guys started out doing it was because that's who they were. They were hackers.
While some software companies discouraged hacking and even prosecuted hackers, many game companies like EA, who published The Sims, actually encouraged players to modify software into new video game content, also known as modding.
When you look at the rise of social networking sites, video sites like YouTube and things like that, if you can take advantage of people's desire to create, then they can extend the experience in ways that these companies literally can't. I mean, it would cost EA way too much money to create all of the types of clothing or furniture that people might want in The Sims. So why not create the tools to let the community create the stuff?
I've always liked that idea, and I've always in my games tried to give the users the ability to be more creative with what they were seeing on screen, that they were in essence creating the world, and the world was kind of pushing back. It's this very interesting negotiation kind of between the player and the world is like the essence of the gameplay I really enjoy. Most people just haven't had exposure to the right tools, and so I think we're getting to the point in software where we're giving the players higher and higher leverage tools so that with a few mouse clicks they can make something on screen that delights and surprises them.
I think in every game player there's a little bit of a game designer. I do this differently, I like to change this. And with modern games, we provide tools to change the basic rules of the game, add maps, scenarios, new units, really kind of design your own version of the game. And by providing that power to the player, we really multiplied the fun of games. You're not just playing my games, you're playing a game that's been designed by tens or hundreds of people, and that makes games a lot more fun to play.
By the end of the 1990s, nearly every strategy and combat game on the market came with a built-in level editor and tools to create custom characters or scenarios.
People could construct their own missions, amateurs, not professionals, and give them to their friends, and then their friends would give them to their friends if they were any good. And basically, you could provide content for an existing game with much less effort than making an entire game by yourself.
And then it became like people started modding the scenarios they wanted, which was like a lot of the times happened to be like World War II, for example. And then like the game companies would catch on because they see like this grassroots movements of all the modders changing all of their commercial products into World War II products, and I think modders had a big part in that.
Most of the most violent video games on the market today that sell are World War II and military simulations. And we might say, all right, well, World War II was the patriotic war, the war where there's moral clarity, the war where there are clear good guys and bad guys.
Although gamers did not live through World War II, it was a conflict that they could understand. And unlike the Cold War that had just ended, it was a real battle that had many heroes to play.
There's something about the past that was so compelling, but you know, like we had influences like Saving Private Ryan, and I guess people can call it like a righteous war almost. I mean, like seeing these movies, and if you had like a grandparent that was involved in it, you know, like it would be like, hey, look what I'm doing, that sort of thing.
As gamers became better designers, they wanted to recreate more recent conflicts. And modders, as they became known, expressed themselves in ways like never before.
It seemed like there was the statute of limitations that started shrinking about like when it was okay to talk about these things. And if you want to talk about the timing of this, the World War II generation was dying off when we started making these movies and these games started being made. So maybe that had something to do with that being okay then, but then it quickly started shrinking. Then we started seeing like the Vietnam conflicts, then we started seeing all the desert, like present day conflicts after that.
Long considered the slacker generation by their parents, Gen Xers finally hit their stride with the dot-com boom. Millions of people were going online. Making full use of the technology and sharing capabilities of the internet, players from around the world organized into a networked population of millions, all striving to outdo one another.
It goes back to community. You know, there's an incredibly creative set of people that play games and that make games.
Someone like Will Wright is saying that in the future, 60% of the content of his games will come not from his professional designers, but from the amateurs in his consumer group. He says the modern games are competing for communities. Whoever can create the most creative community is going to win. And this is a real shift in the ways we think about games, from products to experiences.
I mean, the people would make it, and they would, of course, like be intelligent designers and everything. But like the people that were really throwing their lives away on this stuff and playing it for so much, they would have a lot of insight into what they wanted to see changed. Mods would have a lot of these like common ideas, and they would improve it for like what we wanted, or you know, what was annoying to us would get fixed.
If the 1980s were about the rise of the industry, the 1990s were about the players becoming a part of it. Even though games inherently made people feel powerful, the designers had the real authority. And now players wanted to be the creators, making video games more entertaining than ever before.
Sometimes the kids make mods they put up on the internet and they're better than some of the mission levels. And that's very exciting because when a game gets towards the end of its shelf life, the way you extend play in the game and interest in the game, and of course all of the financial gain, is to let the kids build their own level. It requires that they buy a copy of the game. They can show the creativity of what they've done to their friends.
The smarter companies started supporting their modders more and more. They started to rely on it after a while. They would just have like the vanilla, and then they would let the modders come up with a lot of the other things.
I think at the time we were a little surprised that people not only took the tools for modding games to create new game experiences, but they also took the games and used them as a kind of puppet theater to create films.
By using similar desktop computer tools used to mod games, players also became filmmakers, turning popular video games into animated short stories called machinima.
No, Tucker, you can't hold my sniper rifle until tomorrow.
Machinima, I guess, would be storytelling using a video game or a pre-rendered environment to tell your story. So instead of picking up a camera and going out and shooting something live action, you can use a video game which already has character models, physics, lighting, and everything you need to shoot what the story you want to tell.
Basically what we do is we take a fun interactive medium like video games and then take out all the fun interactive stuff and just make it a narrative. It started back with Doom in the late 90s and Quake, where the creators of Quake decided to put in a gameplay feature where you could record your game so that other people could watch you complete a level quickly, or how you killed the monsters or whatever. Machinima started as a way to kind of brag to other people about how great you were at a game. Kind of like a high score, but, a little cooler.
Without any computer programming experience, Bernie Burns and his friends Gus Cirola and Jeff Ramsey made a little movie out of a big video game, Halo.
Hey, they stopped firing. Why are you whispering? I don't know.
And why don't you give me a mic check?
Burns and his buddies made their films from the comfort of his spare bedroom in Austin, Texas.
Well, I was a failed independent filmmaker. I had a tech job in Austin, and I really wanted a way to continue to write and produce on a regular basis to kind of stay sharp and exercise those skills. And so, not knowing anybody talented, all I knew was Gus and Jeff. I thought, how can I write and still produce something with these, complete losers? And so I thought, well, hey, we all play video games. We could probably use a video game to animate some of these stories that we do and just do funny little skits.
There's no way he survived that.
Turning the soldiers from Halo into film stars was easy.
How's that?
Who went on to say? All right, yeah, it's good. And then I can filter it through a very secret process so that it sounds more like he's talking over a helmet mic.
There's no way he survived that. There's no way he survived that.
Hey, that's movie-making magic right there.
However, serving their demanding audience was difficult.
In the first week, we had probably, 1,000 hits a day, 2,000 hits a day. And then within 2 weeks, we were up to about 500,000 people coming to the site, every day. I don't think we were ready for the popularity right off the bat. Our server basically just completely fell apart. So within 1 month, we went from literally a server, just a computer in the corner of my bedroom, to 4 different servers in 3 different cities around the nation trying to serve this stuff out.
Burns and his team wanted to distribute Red vs. Blue to anyone who wanted to see it. Anyone, that is, except for Microsoft and Bungie, the publishers of Halo.
Hey, dude, the Jeep blew up. No kidding.
Burns didn't have permission from them to use their game.
Great idea.
I remember we were sitting there one day and we were watching the hit counter, and we saw a Microsoft address go by who had watched the video. We thought, oh, that's weird. Then we saw like 5 addresses go by from Microsoft. I thought, well, that's weird. Then we saw like 30.
I remember when we started shooting the link around going, you've got to watch this. And then the question came up from kind of legal eagles, is this authorized use? Should we get some participation if there's any money involved?
Pretty quickly after that, we got a call from Bungie, and it was one of their lead producers for Halo and Halo 2, and he said, we really like what you guys are doing, and we just want to make sure that you do it right so that you can keep doing it.
In the case of Red vs. Blue, the Bungie team was aware of what was being done, loved it, frankly, and the decision was made very consciously that regardless of what legal principles may or may not be pursuable, in fact, it was good for Halo that this was happening. The work was, in its own strange way, respectful of Halo, even though it was there was a parody aspect to it.
It's good to be back here. It's been a long who am I kidding? Even 1,000 years doesn't make this dirt hole any more appealing.
And that's one of the cool things about the video game sci-fi fan culture is if people like something, they go full tilt to support it.
I play Halo 2. I play Halo 2 nonstop. It's phenomenal.
Halo 2 broke records with sales of $125 million in just 24 hours of its release in 2004.
This is great, man. Halo 2, about time.
And Red vs. Blue became one of the most successful examples of user-generated game content. Now Hollywood was finally taking Burns and Machinima seriously.
It was interesting. When I made my film in college, I was writing to all these film festivals and trying to get in and spend a year doing that. And with the popularity of Red vs. Blue, it's been kind of a flip where we've been able to go to film festivals and we get asked to come and talk about Machinima in general. We had no idea when we started all this that, we'd be kind of at the forefront of a whole genre of filmmaking.
Releasing assets and allowing people to create their own previews for movies. And I think that's the wave of the future, and games have simply been willing to embrace that sooner than most other media companies. At a time that the recording industry is suing its consumers, the game industry is empowering those consumers to build and share content with each other.
Today, there's no way to stop the user-generated revolution. The best games do more than make the players feel like a hero. They empower them with the tools to customize games into personalized experiences, something they couldn't do with other forms of entertainment. While this new generation of gamers became more fluent in video game language, some of them would start to use the technology for more than play. As the new millennium neared, the economic globalization that started in the 1990s expanded with the proliferation of the internet and mobile phones. Few people, especially the generation of gamers who grew up with computers, could imagine what life would be like without their digital tools.
Today's generation of gamers has never known a time when you couldn't play with machines.
Players were also learning how to become the video game designers, and soon they would have the tools to explore all kinds of fantasies, even the ones that made the player feel powerless.
It's only now that a large generation of people who've grown up with this medium are getting to the point where they can now express themselves and use the tools themselves. So perhaps that's why you're seeing this interest in games as an art form, games as a form of expression.
In the real world, we cannot escape the tragedies that surround us. And in order to cope with these atrocities, we must express ourselves. Many found different ways after 9/11.
People have written websites about it. People have taken photographs. All of these expressions are valid.
Some found a new outlet: video games. Just 2 years after terrorists attacked the World Trade Center, John Brennan and his classmates modded or converted the game Unreal Tournament 2003 into a real-life experience called 9/11 Survivor.
So in the process of making the mod 9/11 Survivor, we started wanting to make a simulation of a current event. We wanted to try and see what it was like, and so we started building the towers to spec. And we started adding certain elements, and we kind of got stuck on certain things. Not stuck like we couldn't do them, but like they were really fascinating and really eerie, and we wanted to see more of that. And that was kind of like when we had a bot leaping out of the window, out of like the burning office building. And it became less important to build a simulation and more important to like explore what was so powerful about that, or at least go with it and be honest. And honestly, we were intrigued by like the way that made us feel.
So 9/11 Survivor puts you into the shoes of a person trapped in the World Trade Center on the day of the attacks. It's not necessarily a game, but it uses game technologies to explore that experience. And, you know, in speaking with the designers, it's clear that it was a catharsis for them to build that game, post that event, to deal with some of the unresolved imagery. There's no timer or score or, you know, clear objective other than escaping the building, which you can't really do.
The viewpoint of someone who's not empowered or who's really in a horrible position like that doesn't get explored a lot. And that was really what was compelling. Creating that environment and kind of bracketing that interaction, only allowing choices that that person would really have. And I felt like that was doing someone who was a victim like a lot of justice, actually.
What we're playing with is, what does it feel like to be disempowered, and what actions can I take with my sort of reduced palette of choice? And how can being in that situation create new types of emotions for the player? So we're not talking about a power fantasy, we're talking about in a way, an empathetic fantasy of being disempowered.
Producers of other serious games like Darfur is Dying hope that if games could make people feel what it was like to be disempowered, then it could also motivate them to act.
When people talk about the activeness of violent games, then they should also remember the possibility of enacting compassion or enacting powerlessness. And I think that it is very clear, for instance, that if one plays Darfur is Dying, that you can't see the situation of a child in need of water and not want to respond.
A generation of people who are very passionate about the world and how it works and what's going on in our world today. And they're also very articulate and very passionate about the game medium. So put those two together and I think you're going to see a lot more.
Today, a movement called Games for Change provides support for gamers and designers who use digital games for social awareness. And this underground movement has poised the industry for yet another evolutionary leap forward. For although video games began as experimental amusements, designers and gamers have transformed these digital toys into a world beyond entertainment. A world that continues to change and evolve even when the machine is turned off.